So in the last one, we started using this system as a calculator. One of the basic functions of a calculator is to remember some of the values that we're producing. So, for example, if we wanted to remember what the answer to a basic question like 5, we'll try to use an actual key here, 5 plus 5. We know that if we hit this, we get an answer, but that's just an answer. It generates it and then it disappears into the ether for life. What if we wanted to start storing some of these things? And as someone whose memory is not working in his brain as well as it used to, storing things makes some sense to me. So let's start with the names of my family members. So let's, for example, let's do the ages of my family members. Right now, my youngest has, just turned, I should know this, right? This is why I have to have the computer remember it for me. Youngest's age is 9. Now, it doesn't actually do anything here. If I hover over this, it might tell me something. It might not, depending on how it's working right now. But it's kind of calculated this and it's done something here. And you saw the little dancing ants, so we know that it's been doing something. What it's been doing is it's been taking the value on the right-hand side and shoving it into a box labeled youngest's age on the left-hand side. So it's taken this piece of data here, which we're going to call an integer, a number, a whole number, and it's shoved it into a box, and the box has a label on the outside of the box that says youngest's age. So there are a few things to note here. If I go ahead and ask it down here what youngest's age is, there's a couple of ways we could do that, but right now we're just going to kind of do it as an expression. And we say youngest's age, and it spits it back out at us as 9. So a few things to note here. One is that last time we saw that the equal sign doesn't really mean equals. It means it's an assignment. It says put whatever's on the right-hand side of the equals box into the left-hand side. My son was, of course, 8, and then he had a birthday, and he turned 1 year older, and so now if I look here, it's going to come up with the same answer because he's 9. 8 plus 1 is 9. So I've stored whatever's on the right-hand side here, 8 plus 1, into a box called youngest's age. What should I name my box? I'm calling it a box because it really is useful for me, even years and years after learning how to program, to think of these as boxes. And it's actually a variable, of course. And if you've done any programming in another language, you may note that in a language like C or Java, you probably have to tell the interpreter, or the compiler in that case, what it is that you want this box for, where you want, how much memory you want to use in this box, what kinds of things you're going to be storing in the box. Python doesn't care about any of that. As soon as you say, put this stuff on the right hand into a box that I've labeled on the left, boom, it's done. One line of code, it's done. This is one of the reasons people like to use this particular programming language. So some things to note here about naming. I have a garage that's full of boxes still, and always has been since I move every 6 months or so, it seems like. So I have a garage full of boxes, and they are labeled, and they're labeled with things like stuff. That's literally, if you go in my garage, there are a number of boxes that have been, they have labels on them. Either I or my spouse have taken a permanent marker and thought that it was really smart or funny or clever at the time to write stuff on the side of the box. A lot of programmers do that, and as we get further on in the semester or in these tutorials, you're going to see me use variables like I, which I really shouldn't do. Generally, you want to actually say on the left-hand side when you name the box something that's meaningful and useful, so you'll remember why you have that box in the first place, why you've established that variable. Here I've said youngest's age. It's pretty clear. You'll note that I've made a couple of grammatical choices here. One is that I don't have an apostrophe there the way I ought to. Yes, that grinds my gears a bit to see that, just as I would in any kind of writing, but you shouldn't use apostrophes. In fact, I would say that the only, and I think probably the language says this, I could be wrong, that the only kind of letter or number you should use is the underscore. So that's the first thing to note. I haven't done this, which I could have, youngest's age. The reason for that is that this is very confusing to a computer who doesn't understand how you put together two different words into a single meaning, right? So if I try this, I'm going to get an error because it gets the age part, age equals 8 plus 1, but it doesn't know what I'm doing with the youngests over here. So for this to be a variable, it all needs to be in a single line without any spaces or white space in there. So here we have what I should have done, youngest's age. Generally speaking, you should start your variables with a lowercase letter. There's some exceptions to that, but generally speaking, that's a good idea. And you can't start it with a number, but I could kind of put a number over here. I could say youngest's age 2 or something like that if I wanted to. That's fine, but you have to start with a letter. And generally, you should be starting with a lowercase letter. So I have some should and some musts in there. Don't worry about that too much right now. Actually, in a future module here, I will show you that I don't follow that rule sometimes in terms of lowercase letters to lead. I have some uppercase letters that I've carried on as a stylistic thing. But generally speaking, it's a good idea to kind of do lowercase letters and underscores. I'm not going to worry too much about Python style. This course is all about kind of getting things that work. But for this to work, you do need to start things with, with letters and ideally with lowercase letters. And you should name it something that is meaningful. So we've shoved an integer into that box. We're going to talk a little bit about data types that we can put in these boxes. So this is an integer. Let's go ahead and we'll kind of do another kind, which is, we may have talked about this. I don't think we did. So we have an integer. Let's also talk about floats, not flots, but floats, also called floating point numbers. So I could do something like if I needed to remember pi, and it doesn't know what pi is. If I ask it what pi is, it says, I don't know what that is. It's not defined. So let's go ahead and assign it to something. There is a way to get at pi, but we're not going to worry about that right now. So let's just go ahead and assign it the number 3.1415. So I'm going to assign that the number 3.1415. And then if I ask it later on what pi is, it will give me 3.1415. So I've stored a float in there. In fact, if I hover on this, I'm not sure if you'll see this. I'm not sure if it'll get up to me either. So it might tell me what the variable is, but that's okay. So so we've got this kind of a way of storing things that have decimal points in them, floats. There's all kinds of stuff we can put in here throughout. We'll keep adding different kinds of variables, different kinds of stuff we can shove into variables. But for now, let's go ahead and do this. Youngest's, sorry about that. Youngest's age we have. Let's do youngest name. I'm going to make him famous. And we're going to do single quotes. You could do single quotes or double quotes. It doesn't matter. And his name is Kai. So far we've done, up here we've done floats. Oops, we've done integers. We've done floats. And then this one is going to be what we're going to call strings. Strings are just strings of letters. The letters next to each other, like this, a K, an A, and an I. So this is for storing text. Chances are you'll end up storing a lot of text in your life, and so understanding that you can store this is worthwhile. So if I, once again, look here and say, what is in youngest's name, and we run it, and it will tell me Kai. If I were really being silly, I could do youngest's name times 5, and I would get Kai. There's no reason you would ever need to do that. I could do youngest's name plus 5, and I would get an error. So what's going on here? It actually managed to try to figure out what I was trying to ask it to do when I did times 5. But when you ask someone to do a name plus 5, it doesn't know what the heck you're talking about because you have two different types of things there. You have, it actually tells us it's a type error. It needs to be a str, that is a string, not an int, that is an integer. So we've asked it to add a string to an integer, and that doesn't make sense. We could do youngest name plus, we could do this, we could do a string plus a string. We could say, for example, we could have it say, sorry about that, we could have it say Mr. Plus youngest's name, and we would get Mr. Kai. Oops, there's a space missing there. Mr. Kai. So it's fine with that. And there's something else we can do, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. Okay, so we've got floats and integers, floats, and strings. I'm going to introduce you to now. These are kind of all different versions of types of data we can store in variables. I'm going to kind of, oops, that's not what I meant to do. We're going to do it down here. I'm going to talk a little bit here about functions. That is things you can do with the variables. And we're going to run into a heck of a lot of different functions over the next few lessons. But for now, let's just do one of the most common, which is print. And we're going to write the first program. So far, we've only been doing expressions, but we're going to write our first actual program. And this is, by tradition, the first program you're ever supposed to write in any language, which is called the Hello World program. It has one outcome, which is to write Hello World to the screen. In some languages, this can be done in one line of code. Actually, these days in many languages, you can do this in one line of code. In some languages, it takes many, many, many lines of code. It just depends on what kind of programming language you're using. Luckily, in Python, it's very straightforward. Print Hello World. And what this does is it prints whatever's in here to the screen. So we can do another one here. We can do print. Remember, we've stored pi, right? So we can print pi. We stored it up there somewhere. And we also stored the youngest's age, so we could print that one too. Print, whoops. We have to be able to type, as always. Youngest's age. And if we run that, it will give us that. And we could do the youngest's name, and it will do that as well. Print's a useful function. There's a whole bunch of built-in functions, and we'll actually be writing our own functions too pretty quickly here, but there's some built-in ones. There's some others that are useful here too. For example, there is the len function, which tells us how long something is. So the length of my youngest's name is pretty straightforward, right? It's 3, K-A-I, 3 letters. So the length is Kai, right? There's also some built-in functions that let you not run into the problem of trying to add things together. So for example, if I wanted to do Kai and then the number 9, I can switch things around using something called stir. So let's go ahead and do, this is called, for those of you who are communications background, this is slightly confusing, but this is called typecasting usually. So if I ask for pi, right, we know that pi is what kind of a variable? This is the Dora portion of the show. It is a float, right? So if I look at pi, it's a float. But I can convert that into a string by saying stir pi. Oops. Now this doesn't look like it does very much. It just puts the little quotation marks around that, but that's actually not a number anymore. If I try to multiply that by 3, it does what we did before. It treats it like a string. But I can actually now do that. For example, if I do pi plus my youngest's name, it gives me an error, right? Because I'm taking a float and trying to add it to a string. But if I convert this into a string by using stir, converts this into a string and then adds it to the name, then it can actually change that into a string and add them together. Don't know why you'd ever need to do that, but there are cases where you need to be able to, for example, put a number into a string. And so it is useful to be able to kind of cast that over. So good. So we have some functions now that we can use to actually make the computer do something. We have the way to store this information. In the next module, we go on to actually starting to do some things that will allow the computer to start to compute by changing the flow of instructions over space. So let's do that next. Thanks.